Well, hello, and welcome to another episode on NetSupport Radio. And I'm really excited today that we're going to be talking about life skills and well-being and probably plenty more aside. So for today's episode, I'm really pleased to have Dr. Leila Walker with us, who is the co-founder and chief product officer at Persona Education. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Al. Really excited to be talking to you about all things tech, well-being and life skills.
So how long have we got? 4 or 5 hours, I reckon. We could probably crack that one out. There's lots to cover, isn't there?
hours. But maybe for the listeners, let's make it a bit shorter.
Okay, let's go for the succinct summary. Always like when I'm chatting with guests to get a little bit of a background about them, just to set the tone of the conversation. So could you give us a little bit of a flavour of you and your background to start the conversation?
Yeah, of course. So I'm an educator. Basically, I trained to be a chemistry teacher back in the early 90s. And even though my career has taken some twists and turns, I actually still, after all those years in the classroom and senior management, see myself as an educator. So that is me. If you really want to know who Leila Walker is, she's an educator. I live and breathe it. So I spent my first career life in the classroom and moved on to senior management into pastoral roles. Actually, that's where I generally I gravitated to. It was where my interest was. I could see even in those days that if the students weren't in a good place, they were having a bad time in the classroom. So I was sort of picking well-being issues up even when I started in the 90s. And then I don't know, things happened and I got interested in research as well. So I whilst teaching, I decided to try and do a master's and doctorate in education technology. Don't recommend it, to be honest with you, because it's it's a recipe for a lot of stress. However, it meant that actually I began to understand, even more of what was good in the classroom and what could be good in the classroom. So I became more research evidenced in my own practice. And then I moved on to actually working for a couple of research agencies. And then I set up two foundation global programs, actually. One was for Tony Blair. We set up Face to Faith, which is now Generation Global. That's in thousands of schools. And I also set up the IDEA program as well, which is a program for children wanting to be entrepreneurs and gather digital skills. So I sort of started migrating to developing educational technology solutions for a larger audience. And then coming nearer to where we are now, I started being introduced to startups. And one of the reasons I was being pushed into the startup world was I kept meeting founders who were struggling with educational issues. And it seemed really obvious to me that what they were missing from their team was somebody with an actual education background. So I was beginning to fill those pieces a little bit. And then come 18 months ago, I met my co-founder, Pete Reed, and I thought, you know what? I've talked to two other people about it enough. I need to launch myself and give it a go. So yeah, now I founded Persona Education 18 months ago.
Wow. Well, I mean, I think nobody could critique your experience and background on that topic. I mean, at the point where we got to science teacher and a focus on pastoral, I was thinking with my multi-academy trust hat on, I wonder if I could just private message you here and offer you a job. But that's probably going to detract slightly from the broader conversation. Yeah, I'm really excited to unpick some of the things you've learned. And so probably a good segue, given that you've touched on it, is just about current research, some of the strands that you're working on at the moment that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to start by telling you quite a depressing story. So I hope everybody's sat with a nice cup of tea and a comfy chair, because you might need a bit of cushioning with some of the stats that actually I started my research more recently on. So, even before the COVID pandemic, I was interested, as I say, in this well-being issue with our young people. And many educational researchers like Educate, School Dash and the OECD were early 2019 reporting that from about the age of 8, our young people were self-reporting lower and lower well-being scores. It got worse as they went across their teenage years. So it's pretty depressing stuff. Although an interesting fact coming out of their data, according to School Dash, actually, the students in the Northwest and Northeast, which is where I'm from, are happier than those in the Southwest and Southeast where I'm currently. So, but it is all comparative, I should say. It still is not a great story. It's also not a UK issue either. And remember, I'm talking about pre-COVID here. Research from 6 Seconds and the World Health Organization have reported some serious concerns when they've done some well-being and social economic metrics. So, for example, India, 95% of millennials are reporting stress. In Hong Kong, 54% of secondary students show signs of depression. I mean, it's really, really not good out there. There are some countries bucking the trend, like Australia, and again, comparative to the region, Qatar and Thailand. But, you know, these really are exceptions to the rule. And then, you know, you go further into the research and you then start to unpick even more. That's all related. So Deloitte recently did their global report on millennials to show that 64% saying that they just don't have the skills to thrive in today's economy. I mean, these are significant stats. You've probably seen LinkedIn findings, I think it was 2020, from their learning and development professionals that said, you know, to be successful in the workplace required 4 social and emotional skills: resilience, adaptability, communication, emotional intelligence, along with digital competence and cross-functional collaboration. So I suppose I set about trying to understand why our teens are struggling so much, because all the evidence was telling us, it was shouting out at us, our young people are not happy, and there's something going on from primary into secondary that is actually something that we need to start tackling. It really was a horrendous read, and a horrendous trend that we needed to get on top of.
We've always had recognition that there's a huge amount of importance and value placed on that transitions period. So I guess your evidence is kind of reinforcing that in terms of the importance of getting that transition right to potentially mitigate some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you saw, I'm going to sound like a research bot in a moment, but OECD released their, I think, best so far global report on SEL. And the headlines were amazing, but they backed up. So this is post-COVID. They backed up just, you know, really what we'd sort of been showing beforehand. So I'll give you some of the headlines there. So again, they were noticing that and this was global, 15-year-olds, regardless of gender and socioeconomic background, reported lower skills, social and emotional skills, than 10-year-olds. And the decline was larger in girls than boys. In terms of where girls and boys differed, girls reported better on responsibility, empathy, cooperation than boys, but boys scored higher than girls on things like emotional regulation, sociableness, and higher energy levels than girls. But the overriding story, there's an amazing graph that they produce, which is across about, 15 metrics, and the line is all going down for the 15-year-olds compared to the 10-year-olds, apart from 2 metrics. The only 2 metrics that were shown that actually the skills were increasing for our teenagers were around, I need to get this right now, were around assertiveness and tolerance. So, so this research is just shouting out at us, we've still got a problem. We've had this problem for some time, and we do need to start tackling it.
I mean, it's sad numbers to hear, although I suspect for many listening, working in education, it won't be a shock. It'll be more of a validation in many ways. And a lot of these paths all point to the narrative that many of us have shared about, perhaps in our focus and desire to really measure most things as we go through our educational journey in terms of knowledge acquisition, the skills acquisition, whether it's the SEMH based skills or it's the digital skills or the digital citizenship, that seems to have been neglected somewhat in terms of the weighting and priorities, perhaps.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, actually, Al. And I mean, there's several amazing organisations that have been beating that drum for some time, and I'm still of the mind, having been in education as well, that until we have a process where GCSEs or whatever accreditation that these young people are expected to get at the end of their teenage years actually overtly show skills, and they have to show the skills that they've developed whilst at school, then it's always going to be a nice to have, even though the literature shows, I mean, you will know this, and I say, back in the 90s, when I look back, the research shows that the precursor to academic success, good employment, is well-being. It's there, that some stats have shown the schools who are actually really going for it with well-being, they're gaining about 6 months worth, equivalent of 6 months worth of learning, because they've got the well-being right. But it's still not even post-COVID, Al. There's a lot of talk out there. Everybody's going, yeah, we've got to look after the children. We've got to bring it back, in the schools need to address it. And schools are really trying, but actually they're working still in a system that's driving, the traditional academic drum. And so they're struggling to find, well, what tools do I have to help them deliver these skills while still teaching them science, English, maths, etc. Where are we going to do this? And actually, shouldn't we be doing this differently? Because, hey, let's look at the stats. Whatever we've been doing previously ain't working now.
Absolutely. And I'm sure those listening, so much of this will really resonate, that we've all had the narrative of our young learners coming back into school. We need to focus on the well-being, because at the end of the day, happy kids are more likely to learn. And yet actually in parallel, all the narrative is about catch up and knowledge acquisition again. And what are we doing in terms of exams this year? And finding that capacity is the real key. So obviously providing resources is a great way of unlocking a degree of capacity, which kind of brings me on, I suppose, to a main part that I really wanted to unpick with you, because certainly after the last 18 months in the edtech space, in the broader sense, some of the most important narratives we've talked about when it comes to solutions and services and resources is about solutions that are evidence-based. They've got the research backing behind them. You've given us a fairly good insight in terms of the research that you've been doing, which obviously ties in very closely with what, as a result of that knowledge and skills you've been developing, has helped shape Persona Life as a solution. So I wonder if you could just kind of tell us how that feeds in and how that shaped the solution that you have.
Yeah, it's sort of it's a story of two halves in a way. So all this research that I've been telling you about and throwing my stats out, making sure that everybody understands what the problem is out there. We then had to go, well, where's the good news? Where do we see things booking trends? Because always in research, sometimes we look at these horrible stats, but it's like anything, you look for the nuggets, you look for where there's evidence of change that's happening in a positive direction. So we went about developing, I suppose, our theory of change. And a lot of the research was pointing, as I suggested, to the fact that the poor well-being was based on the fact that these kids didn't have some of these basic skills, of communication, resilience, problem solving, you name them. And you might ask, well, why is that? Why does it seem particularly bad for teen years? So I'll just let me explain the teenager a little bit more, because I think that's important to our theory of change as well. So, it's probably pretty common knowledge, especially if you've got teenagers, that it's not an easy period of life to navigate at all. There's lots of things changing for you biologically, but also psychologically, as you're trying to move from childhood into being this young adult with a bit more independence and all sorts of things are occurring in your life that you're suddenly having to deal with more without potentially the protection of your parents and other adults around you to navigate that for you. And as I said to you before, secondary education doesn't seem to be able to, at the moment, be able to do this at scale. Apart from, I'd say a good example is the Cognita schools. They really do have well-being at the heart. So we started to look at not just what life skills actually were the ones that seemed to be making a difference with well-being, but actually, is there another dimension that's actually missing from this theory of change? If our mission is to improve well-being, we know these life skills help develop well-being, but are we missing a trick somewhere? So in parallel to all the research we were doing with life skills and their link to well-being, we started to look at personality insight frameworks. Now, I'm sure many of the listeners will have come across personality insight frameworks. They're quite common in the adult world, in the corporate world. We've seen the good, we've certainly seen the bad, and we've certainly seen where you've had a day being given some insights and then left to do what with. So we did a bit of research in personality insight, for the reason being, you can go as far back as Aristotle, 300 BC, who said, to know yourself is the heart of the wisdom, it's the seed of wisdom. But if coming to more recent social psychologists like Bandura, they were saying, if you're going to really develop, the skills required for life, you have to start understanding self and the other to really be able to get a grasp of these life skills. Because if you don't understand self, how do you start developing skills like respect and empathy and open-mindedness and your self-awareness? So our theory of change just had a different starting position at Persona Education. We decided, let's develop a personality insight framework that is fit for purpose, i.e. it has been made for teenagers. It's not an adult version that we're giving to the young people to do. It's one that uses a framework by two behavioral socialists called Merrill and Reed. But we then went about with some teenagers to start developing our own framework that would make sense to them and make sense to the fact that, unlike, somebody my age who's pretty wired in terms of their personality, the personality of a teenager is very dynamic. Like everything else going in their life, it's very dynamic. However, they can learn to adapt to different situations if they have a better grasp on their personality. So we went about developing basically a learning platform where young people learned about themselves through the personality framework, and through that started taking different modules that were contextualized around something that happens typically in a teenager's life, and develop their skills around those types of events, but always coming back to, right, what's this? What am I learning about myself here? What am I learning about other people here? How am I going to potentially adapt to achieve a better outcome?
Gotcha. So, quite a lot of reflective practice built into that, I guess, as well as part of that framework. I suppose one of the questions listening, and it's really, really interesting, understanding the thought process and the kind of the research behind what you're trying to do there, is looking at, when we talk about social emotional life skills, it for many would be perceived as a really broad range there. So do you have particular areas of focus that the solution is kind of targeting in on initially?
Yeah, well, focus in terms of, we have 6 skill sets, but all of this is based on really some of the most impactful skill frameworks that are out there. So many of your listeners will have heard of Skills Builder. That has quite a play in the UK market and now going international as well. But UNICEF have a great skills framework. The OECD work on things. So actually, we're very evidence-based. We basically took from other frameworks 6 skill sets. And those skill sets were or are being realistic, communication skills, being open-minded, problem solving, being resilient, and self-control. And then within those skill sets are 22 different life skills, such as goal setting or stress management or self-awareness, empathy, respect. So we learned from who seemed to be having the most impact in terms of life skills frameworks, and then we used that in terms of creating our own framework. But you'll know from when I read out, if you were to read what the OECD measures or to see how as really sometimes it's just a different nuance in the term rather than it being a different, skill set. It's just how one interprets.
But I guess clearly there is one of the keys to success is the way that it's delivered to actually engage teenagers and actually get them to understand what they're actually learning and reflecting on as part of the process.
Oh, completely. And again, in terms of, and I don't think, it's funny actually, I was asked to write a chapter for Supercharger Ventures recently, asking, and actually Wise Education have asked me to do something similar. They wanted to understand more how ed tech companies were developing their products. What were you using in terms of research evidence to create your product? So, we used the TPAC, Mishra and Kohler's TPAC framework, which I'm sure you're aware of, and many of your listeners are. And to me, that was the story. That framework resonates so much because, again, as I said earlier, I found myself helping out startup companies because they were often tech-led in their solution, or they thought they had this great technology and were trying to fit it into an educational issue, rather than actually what TPAC does is it says, right, okay, there's 3 areas. You've got content. What is the content you're trying to actually get across here? Then what is the pedagogy? What's the best teaching method to actually get this content, this learning across? And then look at the technology side. How can the technology enhance how you are using your teaching method to deliver that content? So we used TPAC to actually make sure the process we were using to develop our product did that. So, for example, our content was at the heart of it was these personality insights, and then the driver, the pedagogical piece, was the young people using their life skills with this knowledge of personality insights. And then when we came, when I come with the pedagogy, I should say, and this is so relevant to what we learned as teachers during COVID, there was 3 key pedagogies that we've used. One was flipped learning, because I think, especially during COVID, and I know there's a really interesting report that's come out in terms of the use of tech this week in the classroom during the pandemic. But what was interesting is, I think, because teachers had even limited time with those young people, I think naturally more flipped learning was occurring, because they had to really think, when do I need to be there, and what can I leave them with to do on their own? So we already had got flipped learning within our platform, and we suggest, where do you leave the students to reflect and get on with things, and where would it be really good for you to come and facilitate if you've got that time. We also, because I'm a huge fan, use Kagan cooperative learning to make sure that everybody's engaged within these learning sessions. But also something that I think is going to start coming more and more, and this came out of, I think, the research I read from Northern Ireland in terms of, teaching kids across the conflict, was imagined contact. I think, when I went into schools initially, people were saying, oh, we do extracurricular, they go on this trip, they're socializing here, they're going over there, we're doing social emotional learning just through these activities. But I think sometimes we forget, it's a bit like Facebook, we're still in a bit of a bubble with who we are in contact with and what we experience as individuals, even those of us who have traveled a bit, and certainly for a young person we are. So something called imagined contact is something that is being used a bit in certain skills for SEL, and that's where you basically set scenarios that young person may not have been able to have at that point. So they can say, oh gosh, what would I do if that happens to me? So again, we developed these pedagogies and then went, well, what tech would support that? So, in terms of the tech, we definitely went for an online platform because we knew, that's the space where, everybody's moving to, hopefully anyway, but it's the most efficient way. It allowed flipped learning to occur, and it allowed us to do this imagined contact as well, setting up these imagined scenarios. We've got a quite fancy pants algorithm for our personality insights, so that every young person has a very nuanced narrative of what we've learned about their personality to date. That together with natural language generation as well. So I suppose that's the story that I think, Al, I'd love to hear more about in terms of ed tech companies. What are you using to actually even develop an ed tech product? Are you just going gun-ho and iterating, which is fine, or are you using some really good frameworks like TPAC that's out there to just guide you and give you, a little bit of hand-holding to success?
I have to say, and apologies to those listening if Al goes off on a segue, but it's music to my ears. It's a topic that I talk a lot about when it comes to edtech vendors. And traditionally, the business sense is people tend to head to the SWOT analysis of what I'm going to create. And I think that Kohler and Mishra, the actual TPAC is a really good framework, particularly when we talk about co-production, because if you haven't got pedagogy and the content knowledge as part of it, well, where are you going? I also like the kind of updated version with the little c, the context that wraps around it as well, which I think kind of helps focus. But it also highlights that this isn't a kind of everything has to all be in the Venn diagram in the center. There's actually times where it is and isn't appropriate. So I think that really resonates. And of course, the fact that you are recognizing those strands, lots of the information you've shared, I think really for listeners will really resonate in terms of the thought process of it being appropriate and specific to the needs of teenagers. Being someone who likes to advocate and promote on the skills side, I also like that thought process in terms of the flipping, because I think there's also evidence there to actually build on developed skills, because they're actually required to think in a different way on some of those topics. It's the sage on the stage or the guide on the side, isn't it? That kind of movement. So I think that's really, really resonates well. So that's really helpful. I suspect a few people will be pausing and rewinding, trying to copiously take down their notes from all the points you're sharing, which is really, really interesting. I suppose the big question, we always talk about, evidence and research, but the big one that always comes to at the end is kind of impact. So from your perspective, how are students actually benefiting from the framework? What's the kind of the measures that you're looking at?
Yeah, good question. So the measures are, in terms of life skills, we get them to self-report, which is really interesting actually, because still allowing a student to self-report how they feel is going on isn't comfortable with some of our friends in the education sector, because they're like, well, aren't they going to just report, they're brilliant at everything. Actually, what you find is, no, they do not. They're pretty darn truthful with how they feel they've got on with any of learning modules, especially if it's something they've not purchased. And and so we get that reflection from them. So we have, and the teachers are privy to, these dashboard that's in the app that gives them all the metrics in terms of engagement, how they've reported against our 22 life skills, and also we encourage them to reflect in terms of, well, how are you going to use this? What are you going to do next with this? Which is where, our product is starting to iterate. So we've now got a series of activities that we are getting sponsorship for, where we're plugging in skill sets with partner sponsors who then can start informing young people more and more about, how these skills will help them in their sector or in their industry, and maybe even open up some doors and opportunity. So in the short term, we're seeing impact in terms of how young people are reporting, improvement in life skills. It also enables teachers to say, gosh, those students or that group or that individual is reporting so low on these particular life skills, and we have intervention within the app so they can really hone in and further develop certain life skills. But in the next few weeks and months, we are developing, as I say, these sponsored skill sets, which are going to enable our users to start opening their eyes a little bit more to, probably the next stage of their life, which is the employability piece, which so many of them start worrying about, already, because we're like, what are you doing for your options? What are you doing for your GCSEs? What do you want to be in life? It's like, oh my God, I just want to
keep piling the pressure on.
Yeah, exactly. So and that's where we are. And with that last piece, I should add, we're going to be developing awards and certification, so actually that they can actually share with, with friends, even with their teachers, or actually with future employers, actually some of these social and emotional skills that, according to LinkedIn, they're all wanting. So actually, let's give them something they can hand over from a credible company. And I should say, getting a bit techy, my hope in the near future is to potentially use blockchain for the accreditation piece as well. I think it's an interesting piece that HP is taking hold of. But I think if we're serious about SEL and SEL accreditation being taken seriously by employers, and they feel it's validated, then, using things like Verify Ed, who are an amazing blockchain for accreditation, using those types of technology, hopefully will give people a bit more confidence about, sharing and taking these skills further. I suppose going back to your point, Al, until we put that kudos and that importance into the system, it's still going to be a nice to have. And it can't no longer be.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think if we kind of condense down some of the key points that you've kind of really shared, we've got a recognition that pressure in terms of SEMH and wellbeing, even pre-COVID, was there and growing, and it's not going to go away. So we all know that it needs to become more of a priority. The biggest barrier in many cases is time and resources. And you've shared that there are so many resources and frameworks that schools could use. And within Persona Life Skills, you've got all of that condensed together into that kind of single point of reference. And then absolutely, I think it's really, really important to recognize not only is there the short-term impact in terms of giving children the opportunity to learn, develop and reflect on the different skills and challenges they face, but also adding long-term value, which I think is always the way that's going to, extend the longevity and get these kind of mindsets and approaches embedded. So it ticks lots and lots of boxes, and I think it really resonates, well, I'm sure, with everybody who's listening in from a perspective. The last question.
Sorry, I'm just going to add actually to that string. What I think is really important in this area as well is democratization of what's available out there. We've seen from the pandemic, it's widening the gap, between the haves and have-not has widened. So, it's one reason why, interestingly, in July, we made the business decision to develop a free version of Persona Life Skills, so unlimited teachers and student accounts, just to see, actually what is the need out there. Within 6 weeks, we'd had 100% increase in our registrations. Just showed what the need was. So, it's being able to democratize what we've learned as well, I think is key as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's both, congratulations when you're able to make the solution available to support schools. Obviously, in an ideal world, like many solutions, we wish there wasn't a need, but the reality sinks in that actually there's always going to be a need. And actually, the more our lives become more complex, the more we need to develop the skills earlier on in the process. So for everybody listening in from a teaching perspective, school leadership perspective, who thinks, goodness, this is exactly what we need to actually be able to act quickly and start to give our students resources that are tailored for them, specific for them. how would schools go about engaging and connecting with you?
Really simple. You can register direct at persona-life.com. Registration straight on that page. You get immediate access into the app, so you as a teacher can start seeing what's available to you. And important to us, because we know teachers' time is so precious, the training can be done, if you feel like it's not intuitive enough, we've got a small teaching module that actually mirrors how we teach the young people, including a personality insights for teachers. So we've built a framework for teachers where they are taken through 20 scenarios, teaching scenarios, to see how their personality comes across in the teaching environment, which is really always like super interesting to see. You think you're like this, but actually, quite frankly, you might be something else to your colleagues. So yeah, just register at the persona-life.com, and then go and have a look, and then off you go, basically.
I can imagine already there are quite a few listeners' ears pricking up with the potential to undertake their own test and have a look and see whether that validates their own perceptions. But what better way to learn what you're going to be presenting to your students than to undertake it yourself? Outside of connecting to you on the website, persona-life, what about from a social media perspective for people who want to follow the narrative and the resources that you're sharing?
Yeah, so we've you obviously come to our LinkedIn page at Persona Education. We do live a lot on LinkedIn, I have to say. I know not as many teachers, or I do believe it is a growing field, is that LinkedIn with teachers actually. And Twitter, I'm Walker_Leila, and I'm always up for a good old chat around what we should do in education for the good. So yeah.
Good. Well, you heard it here first. Leila's always up for a chat. So everyone go and connect this afternoon, and we'll see what happens. But listen, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for sharing the work you've done and are continuing to do. I can say I think it's a fantastic solution, and anybody who doesn't see this as a priority really needs to pause and reflect themselves.
Well, thank you, Al.